Okay, this is the video for topic 2.8, and we're going to cover the basics of labor, culture, and economy in this one. There are three different learning targets, and we'll just briefly go through each one. The first one was mostly covered in the primary sources, but we learned that there were several different roles assigned to enslaved people, and that they broadly fit into three categories. The first one was what we might call trained specialists, meaning those who had mastered a specific skill that might be needed, such as carpentry, blacksmithing, shipbuilding, or operating and repairing mechanical equipment. These individuals were sometimes the most valuable because their jobs required special knowledge and training. The second category might be called domestic servants, which included household tasks like cleaning, cooking, laundry, and childcare. Domestic servants usually lived and worked inside the home of the enslaver, and while their material situation was more comfortable, they would have had very little privacy and may have been more subject to sexual abuse. The last and largest group of enslaved people were the field hands, or agricultural laborers who did the work to plant and harvest the cash crops on which the U.S. economy was built, including sugar, tobacco, indigo, rice, and ultimately cotton, which accounted for about half of the total U.S. economy by the 1860s. And that brings us to the second learning objective in this topic: explain how slave labor systems enabled the formation of African American musical and linguistic practices. So there are two main slave labor systems you need to know about. The earlier of the two was the task system, and the task system was based on meeting quotas, meaning that the enslaved worker would have been accountable for a certain amount of agricultural production, let's say 10 bushels of rice. With this assignment, the enslaved worker would be able to work independently to produce the required amount of rice, and as long as he could meet his quota, he was subject to minimal oversight and allowed to work at his own pace. This system allowed enslaved people some independence to maintain their linguistic and cultural practices. It was most common on rice and indigo plantations. Eventually, a new labor system came to replace the task system. It was called the gang system, and it was far more brutal and dehumanizing. Under the gang system, a group of slaves with similar size and strength would have worked on the same thing all day, sun up to sundown, driven by an overseer, an employee of the master, to work faster and produce more. This system afforded enslaved people with very little independence and became more common as cotton production expanded across the lower South. While the gang system was extremely harsh, it also led to musical practices that helped lay the foundation of African American music. Work songs with steady, syncopated rhythms were used to help keep the pace of work. These songs were sung in English because overseers didn't want slaves speaking in languages they couldn't understand, but they were among the earliest forms of Black American music. Finally, we'll take a look at the economic outcomes of the commodification of enslaved people. And the first point here is that their labor is literally what made America great in terms of economic power. They grew the cotton that fed the northern factories and made the shirts that made the money that made America great. It's important to understand that even after the northern states started abolishing slavery, they were still economically dependent on southern cotton and therefore on the slave labor that produced it. They depended on slavery indirectly, but they still depended on slavery. And every shirt they sold, every dime they made, was made possible by the labor of enslaved African Americans. It's no exaggeration to say that the entire U.S. economy depended on their labor. And yet, they received no financial compensation for their indispensable economic contributions to this country. They were not paid, and as they were legally the property of others, they had no legal rights to accumulate property themselves. They could not inherit property or will it to their descendants, and so it was entirely impossible for them to build wealth. 150 years after the abolition of slavery, it's clear that this wealth inequality has persisted well into modern times. In 2016, the the typical white family owned more than 10 times the wealth of the typical black family. This is the legacy of the systemic exclusion of African Americans from property ownership, and it remains one of the greatest unresolved injustices in American history.